Borders are an ambiguous phenomenon, a place that is sometimes very peaceful, but also a place that is sometimes very violent. This violence has multiple origins, notably in the imposition of the model of the nation-state and dividing borders. These boundary lines can cut up previously constitute social environments. Alongside these boundary lines, we can also find unique and ingenious legal arrangements to overcome this separating effect. This is the subject of our podcast today. We will talk about the challenges posed by border lines with historical and current examples from the Denmark-Germany border and the Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan border, and also different examples of original and creative innovations which shed light on the border from the angle of cooperation and good relationships. Welcome to the Borders in Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. My name is Ben. I'm a researcher with the Borders in Globalization project. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekoven peoples in the Salish Sea region. Today, we are going to talk about nation-state model and creative solutions for border problems with Nick Megoran, political geographer at Newcastle University. Welcome on board, Nick. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to be here. I'm a great listener to your podcasts, and I'm honored to be on one myself.
Thank you, Nick. But let's start the interview by getting to know you better. Who are you, and what are your areas of work and research?
I'm from England and from Newcastle, which is located on the historic Roman border between the Roman Empire and Scotland, known as Hadrian's Wall. And as a small boy, I was always fascinated by borders. I would look at a map of the world and I would see, for example, France coloured in green and Germany coloured in red. And I would always ask myself as a small boy, what colour are the people who live on the line?
Of course.
And who drew the line in the first place? And as I went to university and studied geography, I began to find a vocabulary for this interest. And the vocabulary was that I was interested in the mismatch between the international boundaries that are drawn by cartographers and geographers and lawyers and politicians and the ethnic geographies of people who live in the borderlands. What happens when those two sets of borders don't coincide? And that is my main scholarly interest. And I've explored that in many parts of the world, but particularly with reference to the Danish-German and the Uzbekistani-Kyrgyzstani borderlands.
Thank you, Nick, for this presentation. And as the title means, we are going to talk about the concept of nation-state. And my question for you is this one. What is the nation-state model and how is it linked to the question of boundary lines and borders, Nick?
The nation-state model is the current dominant way in which we divide up the surface of the world. I'm a geographer. Geography means describing the world, geograph. And just as physical geographers might look at how processes are, through wind or through water, seismic activity have shaped the physical surface of the world. So political geographers look at the processes that have created the political surface of the world, which we see most clearly in the international boundaries that our maps depict. And the dominant idea, if you look at a map of the world, is that of the nation state. This is the idea that the world should be divided up into approximately 200 countries, each with their own neat international border, each with a seat at the United Nations, a flag, and a capital city or capital cities. And the idea that these entities, these polities should represent the characteristics and the interest of a particular nation, however that's defined. And this is a very new cartography. If you look at a map of North America, what we call North America, and you remove international boundaries, you can see the hundreds of different native peoples, the First Nations, the indigenous communities. Those maps are completely different. If you look at a map of Europe, in 1500, there were about 300 different polities in Europe, principalities, archduchies, kingdoms, etc. Now there are about 45. And so this is a relatively new idea in human history. And there are certain advantages to it. The nation state has facilitated the development of modern democracy. The idea that everyone in a particular nation state is an equal member, rather than this is the territory controlled by a feudal lord. This allows a shared sense of responsibility, for example, as expressed in the welfare state system. So it allows modern democratic liberalism, but it has significant disadvantages as well. What happens when the boundaries of the nation state and the ethnic communities don't coincide? These can be very violent and can be very exclusionary for people at the edges. And these nation states can exclude minorities. They can exclude people who don't have formal citizenship, and they also attempt to erase indigenous understandings of territories. So this nation state is a fascinating idea with many advantages, but also with many disadvantages.
Thank you, Nick, for this brilliant overview about the concept and the model of the nation state. In the 19th century, the construction of states, and you spoke about that, the construction of states disrupted previous political situations, and sometimes wars are born from it. I cite a historical example between Denmark and Germany with the Schleswig War. What does this episode teach us about the difficulties of building a modern state?
That's an excellent question, Ben. What became called the Schleswig-Holstein question was in the 19th century used widely amongst educated people in Europe as the stereotypical archetypal example of an unsolvable, intractable ethno-territorial dispute, the Israel-Palestine of its day. That until the 19th century, the King of Denmark, or Queen of Denmark, the monarchs of Denmark, were also the Dukes of Schleswig and Holstein. This was a feudal arrangement. It had no real effect on the peasantry in Schleswig-Holstein. They had to pay their taxes to the church and their taxes to the king, and then they were very much left alone. There were no demands that they should speak a certain language or have allegiance to a flag or a state. And in those territories, you saw a whole range of what we might call ethnic groups, linguistic groups. Various communities would speak different accents of Danish, of the Frisian language, of what we might now call German, and particularly Plattdeutsch, Low German. And so you would find ethnographic studies of the 19th century showed that maybe each village had a different dialect. But in 1848, in the 1840s, there were these democratic revolutions in Europe, and Denmark began the switch to a modern liberal democracy. And part of the implications of that was that everyone who lived in the territory of Denmark we are now citizens, we should identify with the Danish state. And we saw the emergence of nationalism. The Royal House of Denmark, based in Glücksburg, which is actually in Germany now, was a German-speaking a German-speaking elite, just as the elites and royal families of much of Europe were. The English elites were, for example. And so, but suddenly now they were recast as Danish speakers, Danish elites. And the Danish state started to try and insist that its inhabitants in Schleswig-Holstein identify with Danishness, Danish language, Danish crown, Danish nation. And they rose up against this. At the same time in Europe, we saw the emergence of a German nationality, a German identity formation. The brothers Grimm published their first dictionary of the German language, which was a crucial moment. And so there were two wars in the 1840s, which Denmark won. And then in 1864, the Prussians and Austrians defeated Denmark. And what is now the southern part of Denmark, northern Schleswig, as well as the whole of Schleswig and Holstein, was incorporated into the Prussian and then German states. And so in turn, of course, the new German authorities wanted to insist on the Germanification of language amongst the Danish speakers, that they were not allowed to use Danish for education or for worship, for liturgical languages in the church. At the end of the First World War, when the Germans were defeated, there were a series of plebiscites across Europe as part of the Paris peace treaties. And Schleswig-Holstein was also subject to a plebiscite. And in 1920, northern Schleswig was voted to be part of Denmark and southern Schleswig part of Germany. This was seen to be a great democratic process, but it wasn't really, because the way in which the electoral districts were drawn predetermined the outcome. So what it created for the first time was minorities, national minorities with a consciousness. And the Danish speakers in southern Schleswig, northern Germany, wanted to be part of Denmark. And at the end of the Second World War, the British, who were occupying that part of Germany, offered the Danish crown, would you like to have this territory back? And they said no. And so the Danish minority in southern Schleswig, northern Germany, were angry about this, and they formed a political party which campaigned to change the border back. They were an irredentist party, the Südschleswig Wählervereinigung. And then an interesting thing happened. In 1955, as the West German state was formed, it requested membership of NATO, the new US-led defense organization. And NATO said, we don't want our members with territorial disputes. Denmark and Germany must sort this out. And so the two countries gave very important statements, the Bonn-Copenhagen declarations. And what they said was, we recognize the territorial integrity of each other. We don't want to change the boundary anymore. And we also recognize the cultural rights of the Germans living in Denmark and the Danes living in Germany. They are allowed to have churches in their own languages, schools in their own languages, and special arrangements were made that German speakers in Denmark would be able to pursue higher education in Germany, and those in Denmark could go, Danish speakers from Germany could go to Denmark for higher education. And that theatres, cultural life, etc. could take place in the minority languages, and that the kin states would support these. So Denmark could provide finance to the Danish speakers in Germany, for example. Initially, nothing changed. The Danish community in Germany still wished to be irredentist. But come 1968, student uprisings, a change, a younger generation took control of the cultural organizations of the Danish minority in Germany and said, look, we are happy with this arrangement. We can study either side of the border. We speak Danish and German. We can go to Danish cinema or German cinema. We are happy. We don't want to revisit this old argument about borders and control. And so the Danish party in Germany changed its goal from being an irredentist movement to change the borderline to campaigning under the slogan, the regional alternative. And an extraordinary thing happened. By the 1990s, you had German voters in South Schleswig actually voting for the Danish party because they saw it as representing the rights and interests of that locality. And it is one of the most remarkable stories in European modern peacemaking history of how an intense, the archetypal, unsolvable dispute could not only be solved, but you could have such peaceful coexistence that a majority is voting for the party that 2 generations earlier had wanted to change the territorial status. So it's a remarkable example, and scholars describe this as non-territorial autonomy, that the minorities have cultural autonomy. They can conduct their cultural life, church, education, cinema, art, culture in their own language, but they are not seeking territorial change. So this non-territorial example, autonomy, is a creative solution to the type of border boundary territorial disputes that so often afflict the world.
Wow. Thank you, Nick, for sharing with us this great example of the consequences of the nation-state model and the creative solutions, but also I heard you very well, they were political solutions and legal solutions. So thank you for that. Sometimes states cannot or do not want to create boundary lines between their respective territories. And they use a very original and very aware tool, which is the condominium. We find an example of condominium between France and Spain regarding a small island in the middle of the Bidasoa River, which is called Pheasant Island or Conference Island. This means that the 2 states are co-sovereign on the same island, and they share responsibility and operational governance every 6 months. What do you think, Nick, about this legal original tool?
I think it is a marvelous example of the argument that sovereignty does not have to be zero sum. It's either mine or it's yours. Historically, there have been other examples of this. Although Pheasant Island is possibly exceptional in this sense, in that it is an uninhabited island, and both Spain and France forbid people from residing on this island. We can find, though, parallel examples. One is in the domain of maritime boundaries, the example of joint development zones. When East Timor-Leste gained independence from Indonesia, it faced a society in crisis. The oppression and the War of Independence had destroyed the infrastructures. So they were keen to access financial resources. There were valuable hydrocarbon deposits on the maritime boundary between East Timor and Australia. And when the 2 countries had a maritime territorial agreement, they couldn't decide on the territorial control of all of the seabed. However, East Timor needed to access money, and it did not have the technology to exploit these seabed resources. So it made an agreement with Australia that they would extract the resources from this seabed area and that they would share the profits. Now, I think nowadays we would possibly think that hydrocarbons are not a progressive example of how societies can develop. But it was an example of how the 2 states could say, okay, we will leave to a later date the question of who is the actual sovereign, and we will work together in the meantime. But perhaps a more pertinent solution of example of the type of territorial sharing, this creativity that you example, is in the tradition of territorial leasing. This was used extensively in the colonial period. For example, under duress, China leased territories to external colonial powers, with Hong Kong and Macau being returned to China from the United Kingdom and from Portugal in the 1990s. But there are other good examples of this today. There are various examples between Russia and Finland, but possibly the most interesting example is the agreement between Russia and Kazakhstan to lease the city of Baikonur. Baikonur was in the Soviet Union, it was the major space city. It was the Cape Canaveral of the Soviet Union. And when Kazakhstan was given independence in 1991, there were still significant Soviet infrastructures, space infrastructures in Baikonur. Russia wished to continue its space program, and there are benefits for the whole of humanity, I think, in space exploration. Kazakhstan itself did not have the capacity to maintain this. And so a creative solution was agreed that Kazakhstan leased the city of Baikonur to Russia in 1992 for a period of a number of decades. This meant that Kazakhstan maintained sovereignty over this territory. However, it became Russian legal space. Russian courts and schools and hospitals and post offices and police operate in Baikonur. Yet it is, and although it is one of the most significant cities in Russian Federation, it is not represented in Russia's Federation Council. Rather, it is governed by an emir who is appointed jointly by the governments of Kazakhstan and the presidents of Kazakhstan and of Russia. So this is a creative solution that says we don't have to have a zero sum. It's not either Kazakh or it's Russian, but it enables us and allows us to cooperate in this important area of scientific activity. And there are other examples of this. And this could possibly be a solution to the Crimean conundrum, which is a major factor in the current war between Ukraine and Russia. It could be, for example, that Crimea might agree to lease. So Ukraine might agree to lease Crimea to Russia for a certain extended period, whilst maintaining sovereignty over it, and whilst also having a formal role in recognizing and protecting the cultural and linguistic and civil rights of Ukrainian, Tatar, and other minorities that live in that territory.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for sharing with us this example of joint development economic zones and about this fascinating example of territorial leasing. Let's now talk in a little bit more detail about another geographical space, which is your field of study. This is the Ferghana Valley. This valley is mainly in Uzbekistan, but it also crosses the border with Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Can you shed some light on the effects of boundary lines in this valley? What is actually happening on the ground, Nick?
I have been visiting the Uzbekistan-Kyrgyzstan border area now for nearly 3 decades. I first went in 1995. And in some ways, you can draw a parallel with Schleswig-Holstein in the Danish-German borderlands. Before the 19th century, these were feudal societies that had no ethnic basis. Mm-hmm. The whole of Central Asia was ruled by a number of hierarchical feudal khanates. The Khanate of Kokand owned that territory, and you also had the Khanate of Khiva and the Emirate of Bukhara controlling much of the rest of Central Asia. And so the Ferghana Valley, under the Khanate of Kokand, was a non-ethnic polity that elites would speak Persian, and possibly the religious elites would know Arabic. Ordinary citizens, ordinary subject peasants would know different dialects of Turkic languages and of Farsi Persian languages. The Russian Empire conquered this as part of its colonial project in the 19th century, but maintained these structures. However, with the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union took control of this territory and created one of the most remarkable political geographical structures that the 20th century saw. This was the Soviet Union. At the federal level, the Soviet Union was meant to be a non-ethnic, non-religious state that was committed to the furtherance of socialism and global revolution. And yet it was composed of 15 union republics And these were each defined on an ethnic basis. Some of these were long-standing states, so Russia, for example, and then during the Second World War, the Soviet Union conquered Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. Georgia, Armenia were also long-standing. They had long histories as ethnic states. And yet others were brand new. And this is true of Central Asia. The Ferghana Valley became divided between three new Soviet socialist republics. Think of those as like the provinces of Canada or the states of the United States or the counties of Great Britain, of England. These had never existed before. Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and Tajik Soviet socialist republics. New boundaries were drawn. Regional dialects were codified as languages. Capital cities were established in some places. These had only been villages before. And the goal in Soviet ideology was that these would be simply stepping stones to socialism, and that when private property relations were abolished, ethnicity, religion, and all these other epiphenomenon of class oppression, as the Marxists saw it, would wither. But of course, they did not wither. Instead, the Soviet Union itself withered. And in 1991, these three countries became independent. They did not seek independence. There was a referendum that year on approving a new constitution for the Soviet Union. And more than 90% of the populations of each of these countries approved it. There was not a significant movement for independence. And suddenly they were thrust and created as independent states. Initially, the leaders of these states promised that there would never be borders between them. They signed treaties of eternal friendship. In 1996, the presidents of Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan signed such a treaty and declared there will never be borders between us. But over time, the new international boundaries that materialized in 1991 became functional borders. And this was largely driven through macroeconomics and also through concerns about security. And so villages and towns and communities that happened to cross the boundaries that were created only as administrative boundaries in the 1920s suddenly found themselves split in two. Barbed wire fences put through villages, cross-border roads blocked, bridges demolished, bus routes ended. Daily patterns of commuting across the boundaries were stopped. In some places, minefields were laid and soldiers patrolled, shooting those attempting to cross. Because these borderlands were functionally united in the Soviet time, this caused great harm to local populations. Many people in the borderlands would have family members living either side. They would have gone either side for work or study, and suddenly movement is stopped. It created great suffering and hardship, economic harm and violence, and also insecurity for transboundary minorities. Large numbers of Uzbeks live in Kyrgyzstan and of Kyrgyz in Uzbekistan because the ethnic and territorial boundaries didn't match. And so this created the type of situation that we saw in Schleswig-Holstein previously.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for sharing this great example of Ferghana Valley and the imposition of model state and the hard consequences, hard effects of the nation-state model in the region of the world without this model before. Very interesting. As I said in the introduction of the podcast, borders are very ambiguous. They can be the source of violent tensions, but also peaceful cooperation. I read in the news that a border clash took place in 2022 at the border between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Some Uzbekistan troops opened fire, and Kyrgyzstan had reported the killing of 3 of its citizens. How can we avoid this kind of violence created by the presence of borders?
The broad answer is, across the world, it depends on the goodwill of the two national states. The problem we see with border policies is that they are created by politicians in capital cities, and these capital cities are usually far away from the border communities that they actually affect.
Exactly,
and this is the perfect example here. But violence is not determined to happen. And in 2016, the president of Uzbekistan, Islam Karimov, the first president of the country, who had been the wall and the border builder, he died. He was an old man, and his successor, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, took over. His first goal was to improve relations with neighboring states. He visited Kyrgyzstan and significantly reopened border crossings. Visa demands which had been made were withdrawn for border dwellers. And in some of the places that I've studied, the villages and towns that I've studied, he not only made the existing crossings easier, but reopened new crossings that had been closed for a decade or a decade and a half. I was back there this summer. The Borders in Globalization project were supporting my research there, and I visited a village which I've known for a long time, which had been literally cut in two by a barbed wire border fence in 2010. And a nearby border crossing was opened for the first time since that period. And people were able to go backwards and forwards and see family members they hadn't seen, in some cases, for a decade and a half. And so the level of violence has significantly reduced. Economic activity has mushroomed to the economic benefit of both sides of the border. And so it was exciting and positive to see these developments taking place. So we can avoid this type of violence. What the best way to do that is through the determined will of both countries to make borderlands work well for their inhabitants.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for emphasizing the importance of taking care about the borderlanders and the peripheries of states. A few years ago, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan exchanged land in a historic settlement to eliminate all kinds of border tensions. That's another tool. That's another creative tool. What do you think about this example? And is the territory exchange a fairly well-known tool, in your opinion, in order to build peace?
Indeed, it is. And the exchange of territory, or another way to put it would be the agreement on a boundary delimitation, is often the way in which conflicts and wars end. So, between 1993, Eritrea gained independence from Ethiopia, and this was after a long and bloody conflict. And yet, it didn't solve the conflict. There was a dispute around the territory boundary dispute in the village of the area of Badme. And in 1998, a terrible war erupted between Eritrea and Ethiopia. It was like trench warfare, that sort of type of warfare we saw in Europe in the First World War. Estimates put it between 70 and 150,000 soldiers died in that war, one of the most destructive wars in recent times. And subsequently, an arbitration was sought in which a boundary delimitation agreement was suggested. The Ethiopians rejected that. More war looked possible. But then in 2022, a new president rose to power in Ethiopia. And he, a young and dynamic man, made it his first goal to sort out agreements with Eritrea. He visited, there was a peace treaty signed, and last year, on September the 11th, the border crossings were reopened, and there were wonderful scenes, which you can see these on YouTube, of people embracing family members who hadn't seen each other for 2 decades, embracing each other. And this involved a territorial compromise. And the way in which this is often done is through seeking third parties like the International Court of Justice to arbitrate. But the problem here, the exchange of settlement of land is a sensible and reasonable way to end a conflict. But the problem is that under nationalism, land becomes national territory. It becomes seen as sacred, as holy to the nation. And so there can often become great resistance in amongst populist politicians to land being transferred. We've seen this in Central Asia. So last year, another territorial exchange was agreed between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. And there were protests around this. And the protesters were put in prison. And I think the government was thinking of a case in 2005. In 2005, China and Kyrgyzstan reached a territorial settlement, a boundary delimitation treaty. This was a good thing for Kyrgyzstan to maintain positive relations with a powerful neighbor like China. It involved territorial exchanges of land that was virtually uninhabited, mountainous regions, snowbound mountainous regions, and yet opposition politicians in Kyrgyzstan mobilized around this, and they said, the government, the president is giving away our land.
Yes.
And they used this to mobilize a violent overthrow of the government. So to answer your question, territorial exchanges are sensible and logical and reasonable ways of resolving these disputes, but they run up against the emotion that we attach to territory in the age of nationalism as somehow sacred or eternal. And it is the duty of the nation to protect this sacred land.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for your answer. Now we could speak about other original territorial situations, and there are a lot all over the world. For example, in France, you have the Livia Enclave. It's a Spanish territory surrounded by the territory of France. But these enclaves situations also exist between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. For example, the towns of Shaimardan and Sok. These are two small exclaves of Uzbekistan surrounded by the territory of Kyrgyzstan. Nick, please, what is an enclave? What is an exclave? And how this situation can pacify relations between neighbors or, on the contrary, worsen them? And finally, on these enclaves or exclaves, how do people live from day to day?
So an enclave or an exclave, they are virtually exchangeable terms, is an island of one country's territory entirely surrounded by the territory of another country, a single other country. And so, for example, of Sok is an exclave of Uzbekistan, enclaved within Kyrgyzstan. But in effect, we use the same words interchangeably. And there are three main places in the world where there are concentrations of enclaves. There are individual ones, which, as you have said, can enable states to creatively resolve particular tensions. So Livia is a place I visited on holiday last year, and it's a marvelous example of that. But there are three main places in the world historically where there have been enclaves and exclaves. And some of these work very well. One example is the boundary between Belgium and the Netherlands, which I think we might discuss later. It's a very creative and positive solution. In some, they work very badly. The second major concentration of enclaves was that between Bangladesh, East Pakistan, and India, the Cooch Behar enclave, some 150. And here, because the relations between India and Bangladesh were very poor, the suffering and difficulty for individuals who lived in them was very, very significant. If people didn't have the right documents, they were not able to travel between little parcels of land to get healthcare. And this was a very complicated patchwork. You had enclaves and you had counter-enclaves, which would be an island of one territory in another. And on the Bangladesh-India boundary, there was one counter enclave. That was a piece of India in Bangladesh. Extraordinary example. And they were dissolved. I forget the year. It was relatively recently, wasn't it? Was it about 10 years ago, Benjamin? Do you remember?
Yeah, maybe yes.
And the two countries dissolved these because they were working so badly. And then the other example are the 7 enclaves in the Ferghana Valley, including Soch, which is the world's largest enclave. And I've been there on various occasions. And these have worked moderately well. They are somewhere between the examples of India, Bangladesh, Kyrgyzstan, and the Netherlands and Belgium, in that they are. So, for example, Soch is an Uzbekistani exclave in Kyrgyzstan, inhabited by Tajik-speaking populations. And so it recognizes, what this does is it recognizes that the ethnic group in this territory is different to that around it, from that which is around it. And so it enables this model of the nation state and minorities to persist in a certain way. At times, when relations between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan have been poor, life has been hard for those in the enclaves. But at the moment, with relations between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan being better, life is easier for them. And so enclaves and exclaves do provide an ability for minority communities to survive or to recognize historical land use and land rights, as in Livia. But ultimately, it comes down to the will of states. Are the two neighboring governments determined to make this work well for their residents or not?
Thank you, Nick. Yes, the example of enclaves is an ambiguous one too. But regarding this phenomenon of enclaves, I wanted to talk a little bit more about a very complex situation, and you mentioned that, between Belgium and Netherlands, where we see Belgian enclaves in the Netherlands and Dutch enclaves in Belgium. Everything is very intertwined on a very small geographical area. All this happens in the municipality of Barley, divided into Barley-Nassau, it's a city in the Netherlands, and Barley-Hertog, it's a city in Belgium. There are therefore 2 police services, 2 post and telephone networks, 2 town halls. In short, these 2 municipalities have no choice. They must cooperate and make compromises. They need to be tolerant with each other. And these 2 municipalities have also been able to develop several common services together. A road construction is done jointly, but also these 2 municipalities share a tourist office and a cultural center. And they succeeded recently in establishing a single waste management system and a single fire brigade. There is an even large company that is cut in 2 by the borders. Nick, my question is this one. Do you think that these practices of cooperation across many boundaries can be a good example for other parts of the world?
It is an excellent question, Ben, and a fine example. Your listeners may know of a novel by the author China Miéville called The City and the City. And the novel is about 2 cities that coexist on the same geographical space, and some of the problems which come as a result of that. Barley-Hertog or Barley-Nassau is the opposite of that. Its origins are in feudal land divisions going back to the 12th century. And what we see in this remarkable system of cooperation is that an otherwise uninteresting borderland, if I may say so, has been able to market itself for tourists internationally as a border tourism destination.
Yeah.
Before the European Union's single market, people would make money smuggling. They would smuggle butter and agricultural goods. The single market deprived them of this economic opportunity. Yet it was only in the 1990s that this boundary was delimited and agreed by the two states. And so what they have done instead is, using the success of this remarkable system of cooperation, they have established tourist trails. So you go to the tourist office and you can hire bicycles and take walks. And so it is an excellent example of how you can coexist. If I can give you one story there, two stories that amuse me in particular.
Yeah, please.
I visited it last year. It was my birthday, and as a birthday treat, I thought I would take a little trip to this border area, and I stayed in a hotel right on the boundary. And there are 6 firework shops in a space of a few hundred meters. Now, a village of 10,000 people does not need 6 fireworks shops. So what is the reason for this? Well, the reason is that in the Netherlands, you can only legally purchase fireworks just before New Year, once a year. But the more fun-loving Belgians are allowed to buy fireworks all year round. So in these little Belgium exclaves in Netherlands, you have fireworks shops, and the customers are all Dutch people. And I sat on the border in a bar, drinking a beer and watching, over an afternoon, all these Dutch men and their teenage sons carrying these great boxes of fireworks. They were enjoying themselves. And people make a life out of this. There is one house on the high street, and it's a very famous example. And the rules in the town are that the front door, the country on which your front door abuts, is the country of which you are a citizen. And because so many houses and gardens are dissected by the boundary, this is necessary. Now, there is one house on the high street, and the boundary runs right through the middle, and the front door abutted onto the Netherlands. And the owner apparently wished to make some changes to his home and couldn't get planning permission from the Dutch authorities. So he put a new front door in 2 meters to the right. So he was in Belgium. So he said, well, now I'm actually Belgian, so now I can get the permission. And so it's a wonderful example of being creative as a way to solve and to address some of these territorial issues in a way that not only doesn't hamper life for locals, but allows them to succeed and to prosper. Now, but of course, the counter to this is that the EU's internal border openness is predicated on its external closeness.
Yes.
Because as we saw in 2015 and 16 with significant migrant movements to the EU, if you're in one EU state, you can enter another one. And this, as many people in 15 and 16 fled violence and war in the Middle East and North Africa, the EU significantly closed its borders. And we know that thousands of people have died on the EU's external borders since that time. And so the openness of the EU's internal borders is predicated on the violence of the external borders. So that is a complication there. But in terms of examples for other parts of the world, the lesson I think we can take from this is be creative in how you draw boundaries and how you think about sovereignty. And a good example for me would be the idea of sovereign regions within states. And possibly one of the most famous examples is the Åland Islands. The Åland Islands in the Baltic Sea are part of Finland, but they are inhabited almost entirely by Swedish speakers. This the Finnish territory over them is a product of wars and geopolitics in the past. And so to accommodate this, the only official language is Swedish, even though this is part of Finland. All Finnish citizens, even those who are ethnically Finnish, must speak Swedish. And there are particular tax mechanisms there as well. And so this sharing of sovereignty, this recognition from the Finnish state that sovereignty must be tempered, has enabled the thriving and the persistence of the Swedish minority on that territory. And this is significant. If you think of 2023, think of the Nagorno-Karabakh example.
Mm-hmm.
Armenia effectively lost this conflict and faced with rule by Azerbaijan, virtually the entire population of the Armenian enclave, which Armenians have been living there for over 2,000 years, voluntarily evacuated to Armenia because they were afraid that they would not be able to continue their existence. 100 years ago this year, the Conference of Lausanne imposed a treaty, the final post-World War I treaty, resolving the war between Turkey and Greece and Bulgaria. And a key principle of this was population exchanges. 1.5 million Greek speakers, Greek populations from Turkey were moved to Greece, and Turkish populations, or rather Greek Muslims, were moved from Greece to Turkey. And this idea was that the borders of the nation state must coincide with the ethnic borders. And if you are a minority, because our borders are right, clearly you live in the wrong place and you must move. This principle of ethnic cleansing, which was seen as peacemaking a century ago, is one of the darkest sides of the nation state. And examples like the Åland Islands show that if we can be creative with our sovereignty, we can avoid those forms of mass violence.